Hello, I am Percio Castro from Nibble Technologies, and today we're continuing with our series of demos around Otelscope. In our previous video, we had an overview of the base Otelscope demo environment. In this video, I'll walk you through setting up the demo environment. We'll clone the demo repository from GitHub, we'll explore some of the files, and finally, we'll build the Docker images that we'll later use when running the demo. For this first demo environment, we'll keep things simple, and we'll configure our OpenTelemetry collector to route the traces, metrics, and logs to local log files. So the very first thing we want to do is clone that GitHub repository. So I'm going to switch over to my browser, and you want to go to github.com/nibbletech/demo. This repository contains all the artifacts that you need in order to build and spin up the demo environment. In this repository, you'll also find this README file that contains step-by-step instructions on how to build and set up the environment. Please take a look at this README because it also contains some prerequisites that you will need to perform, such as generating credentials from the Software-G container registry so you can pull down the API gateway, MSR, and universal messaging Docker images. Alright, so let's go ahead and clone this repository. I'm going to use store.git to clone it right here on my desktop. And once the repository is cloned, I'm actually going to switch to a branch that I created that is specific for this demo. So I created a branch called Otelscope to file target. Alright, so now all the files from the repository that we need are actually here on my desktop. Now there are some additional files that we need to move into this demo workspace before we can actually build and set up and run the environment. So these are things like the Software-G license files as well as the Otelscope installation files. So let's do that now. First, let's copy the Software-G license files. I'll copy the API gateway license file, and it's going to go into wm apig config. Similar with the MSR file. wm msr config, and finally the universal messaging license file, wm um config. Alright, and last but not least, we'll copy the Otelscope installation files. Like we talked about during the environment overview, Otelscope is nothing more than a set of web methods packages. Now these are fairly robust and complex web methods packages, but nonetheless they are simple web methods packages that you install just like any other package. So we have the common package that contains the instrumentation agent. This is the same instrumentation agent that we use for Nanoscope, our web methods profiler. NT-Otel logs has services that your application can call to emit log events directly to the OpenTelemetry collector without having to write them to a file first. And Otelscope is the actual workhorse that's collecting all the events from the service executions and from the server itself, and then it's emitting those events to the OpenTelemetry collector. So we're going to go ahead and copy these files into our demo workspace, and they're going to go under wm Nibble. Alright, so now we have all the files we need in our demo workspace so that we can build and run this environment. Now before we do that, I actually want to show you behind the scenes what these files look like so that you understand what is being done and how. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to open up the demo folder here. Alright, so let's take a look at this, what's inside this demo folder. So as we talked about in the overview of the environment, we have 5 major components. We have Newman running inside of a container, and it's going to be posting requests to our API on the API gateway. We also have the OpenTelemetry collector, and as far as web methods components go, we have an API gateway, an MSR, and a universal messaging server. Alright, so starting with the OpenTelemetry collector, if we take a look at the configuration here, you'll see that we're doing a few things with the OpenTelemetry collector. So one thing that we're doing is that we're actually parsing the server log from the MSR as well as from the API gateway, and we're grabbing all those events from the server log and we're emitting them to the OpenTelemetry collector. So the OpenTelemetry collector is actually going to be receiving these events, and then they're going to be sending them to the target. Now, in addition to that, Otelscope, of course, is going to be monitoring the execution of the services on the API gateway as well as on MSR, and it's going to be sending those traces to the OpenTelemetry collector. And last but not least, we have metrics. So Otelscope is also going to be monitoring some metrics on the server, things like CPU utilization, memory usage, number of sessions, number of threads, and as well as business metrics. So a service can actually invoke services within the Otelscope package to create metrics and to submit business metrics to the OpenTelemetry collector. Now, where will all this information end up? So this is where our targets are configured. So we have these exporters. So traces are going to end up in the OTLP traces.json file. Metrics are going to end up in OTLP metrics, and logs are going to end up in OTLP logs. All right, when it comes to the web methods components, these are fairly straightforward. You guys are all familiar with the API gateway, MSR, and just want to highlight a couple of things. We have an Otelscope configuration file that actually points to the OpenTelemetry collector that we're running inside of a container. And also, one more thing that I want to highlight in this configuration file is the service name. So as you can see, inside the API gateway, we are identifying the API gateway to the OpenTelemetry collector as using this ID, APIG. On the MSR, we're actually going to be identifying ourselves as MSR. This service name helps us identify where the events came from when we're actually looking at the target. So when we're looking at the target files being generated by the OpenTelemetry collector, you will see that the events in those files have a service name associated with it. If it has APIG, then that event was emitted by the API gateway, whereas if it has MSR, that event was emitted by the MSR. Now, just a quick peek into the Docker files for these components. The main thing that we're doing here is copying the license key. We're making the server logs directory accessible so we can mount it onto the OpenTelemetry collector. And then we're removing some packages that we don't need for our demo just to keep our image small and our startup time fast. But last but not least, we're actually installing Otelscope along with all the other packages that it needs. So this is happening for the API gateway as well as for MSR. And for universal messaging, there is a whole lot going on here. We actually probably don't need to build a universal messaging image, but we do just in case we need to do some more customization in the future. All right, so these are all the files behind the scenes that are actually controlling how this environment is going to work. Now, I have some helper scripts here to help us build the environment because, of course, we have these Docker files and we need to run Docker build on these files so we end up with Docker images that we can actually spin up. So because we're using Docker Compose and we have different Docker Compose files in each of these folders, I created some helper scripts so that we don't have to type these longer Docker Compose commands every time. Okay, so we're going to start by building the environment. So since I'm on Windows, I'm going to use build.bat, but if you're on Mac OS or any other Linux variant, you can use the shell scripts in this folder. So I'm going to go ahead and run build.bat, and this is going to build my APIG Docker image, my MSR Docker image, as well as the universal messaging Docker image. And it's done. Now, the first time you run this, you should be aware that it's going to take a little time because it has to pull the source images from the Software-AG containers registry. And the API gateway image that we're using today is actually fairly large, so it's going to take a little while, but after you download it for the first time, after you pull it for the first time, it should run just as fast as mine did here. So now I can actually type Docker images here, and I'll filter it with Nibble, and you can see the three images that got created. The Nibble APIG, which is for the API gateway, the MSR, universal messaging. Alright, we've built our demo environment, and we're now ready to spin it up so we can actually pump some data through it. So please check out our next video where we're going to demonstrate how to push data through our demo environment. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us via our website, via LinkedIn, or via email at info@nibble.tech. Thank you so much.